So we're here with Peter Yarrow of Peter, Paul, and Mary. And,
She speaks the truth. It is true.
And
we have no longer Mary, but the spirit, the tradition, and the commitment of the trio lives on. And this is Heidi Vierthaler.
You know my name pretty well by now.
I do, that's right.
But that's an honor. So what is the relevance between the music that you did in the March on Washington to what you're doing today with the fracking, or the working against the fracking rather, and the mountaintop removal and all those ecologically fragile things that we need to take care of in our environment?
Right. Well, in the March on Washington, in America, we realized that ordinary human beings could rise up, bond in their hearts, and commit themselves to making a change, and that we could be successful. And realizing that, it empowered this country to go forward and not just simply look for top-down changes. You know, say, oh, well, if you want to make change, you have to go to the people that are elected and get them to change the laws. Now, there were many grassroots movements before then, but in current times, it was really the 60s that made it very clear that this horrific legacy of slavery that continued in our country until, at least up to 1963, there was one lynching every 3 days, and if you went to our nation's capital, you saw that there was, if you were a person of color, you couldn't use a bathroom in most places, unless it said for colored only. And I mean, just the manifestations of segregation and the abbreviation of civil liberties for people of color was comprehensive. And yet we walked around saying, with liberty and justice for all. How could we have that kind of blindness? Well, it's the same kind of blindness and the same kind of issue that we have now. How can you not acknowledge that there is a threat to the environment, that there is global warming? It's as clear as it was that there was an inequity between blacks and whites at the time, that there was, and it still exists, there's racism in our, particularly in our criminal justice system. But now what we have is, we stand on the shoulders of the people who created the civil rights movement, who proved that you can make those changes if you stay the course and if you band together, ordinary human beings. You don't have to be wealthy, you do not have to be in office, you don't have to be the head of a corporation, just a person who is willing to put your body on the line. And that means that we now know from our own history, we stopped the war. The war was not stopped in Congress. The war was stopped in the streets. And then Congress acted on it. The civil rights movement it crystallized, and ultimately it became law in the Civil Rights Act. But today, we have to know that it is the ordinary human beings that get together in various movements like Occupy, or the anti-fracking demonstrations, or the mountaintop removal demonstrations, or, for instance, the demonstrations that I've been involved in with Peaceful Uprising, and you can go to the website of Peaceful Uprising, and Tim DeChristopher, who is known as Bitter 70. And you can see that when we do stand together, and we have the information technology to bind us. We don't have to have a huge march on Washington to know that we're together. It's the same phenomenon that allowed Tahrir Square to emerge as a beacon for the Arab Spring. And so it is that today we are faced with crazy oppositional a circumstance where enormous number of people, number one, vote against their own interests, deny the danger to the next generation, or simply have been persuaded that that's the right way to be, that it's all about their getting money rather than our being a society where we take care of each other and we take care of the earth. And I have a granddaughter, Valentina, and she's been demonstrating with my daughter Bethany at the anti-fracking rallies. We were together, she and I, my daughter Bethany Yarrow, and in front of Governor Cuomo's offices in New York. And she was down in
Albany or in New York City?
In New York City.
Oh, okay.
And it wasn't long ago. And also, she, Valentina, now 5.5, but then 4.5.
Right.
She was at Occupy Wall Street with her little picket sign saying, "We want fairness," and her schoolmates. It's a tiny little school saying, "We want a bright future. We want kindness." That's what it's all about. I mean, it has to come from the heart. So it's not just policy. It's a matter of where we come from in our hearts in terms of saying we care about each other. And she started very young, yes, 4.5.
Right.
But it's happening, you know. And the other people we've been with, Bethany and Rufus Cappadocia, her cellist. Mm-hmm. And I sang a concert on the eve of the trial of Tim de Christopher. Now, Tim de Christopher is now serving 2 years in jail. And he could have gotten off with a 30-day sentence, but he refused. He wanted to take it to the justice system. And, of course, once you do that, you're at their mercy. And the cards are stacked against you. And he wasn't even allowed to tell the jury why he did what he did. What he did was he was picketing an auction of Bureau of Land Management parcels, at an auction that was filled with illegalities and irregularities. And he walked in and they said, "Oh, are you here to bid?" And he said, "Why, yes." And they gave him a paddle with an 80 on it, and he became bidder, a 70 on it, bidder 70, and he sat down, and they were going for extraordinarily low prices because they hadn't gone through all the proper process. It was in the last period of time of the Bush administration, and it was kind of a favor to the oil and gas interests that wanted to take over and these lands and buy them that are near canyon lands and Arches National Park. I mean, really sensitive, extraordinary, pristine lands. And $1,800,000 later, he'd won a lot of land. He did not, however, have any money. So the point was, but it was entirely intentional because what he was doing was throwing a monkey wrench in between the collusion between the oil and gas interests that were owed favors from the government because they'd contributed to the campaigns of George Bush, etc., 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 etc. And that happens now, and it's destroying democracy. Well, the eve of his trial, Bethany Yarrow and I and Rufus did a concert at his Unitarian church. And by this time, we'd gotten the whole peaceful uprising movement singing and involved in singing, and it was very important to them. It really, really does stir your heart. And that's part of the legacy of the March on Washington and what Peter, Paul, and Mary sang, because this was the way of affirming our conscience. And for those of you who are listening, realize that if it comes from the intellect rather than from the heart and from the singing, you won't be strong in the same way you will if you have the heart and the singing involved. Well, ultimately, he was sentenced, and I came down for the sentencing day. And now there's a film out that you should look for called Bidder 70. And you'll see what's been going on, and you see that a peaceful uprising that he organized. He's one of the two or three people that organized it. Also went to Washington, and they had an action in which over 1,000 people were arrested, including Bill McGibbon, who's one of the brilliant.
I've met him. He's wonderful.
He's really, really brilliant. And there's a new film out called Chasing Ice that you should see, that I just saw at the Telluride Mountain Film Festival, that is the smoking gun of the environmental movement. It shows the incremental depletion of the glaciers. I mean, it's incontrovertible. And it is also, at a certain point, going to be irreversible if it's not already.
Right.
I mean, it's certainly not going to be possible within any scope of the imagination to replace the mountaintops that have been removed.
And what about how many fracking wells there are out there that I had no idea?
I know, people don't know. They think, oh, well, maybe there are 2,000, 3,000, 10,000 wells that where they fracture the rock and put these poisonous chemicals into the ground that could leach, and in some places they do, and then the people light the water out of their faucets, and in order to get fresh water, they sign an agreement that says they're not going to talk about it or bring a suit. And that's how it's kept quiet. But under the Bush administration and our vice president, over 500,000 of these wells were drilled. And Vermont is the first state that I know of to have outlawed them. But it's like with the anti-nuke movement that started this whole thing. People said, oh, they're safe, and we stopped them from going online. And then ultimately, of course, where they continued, we had 3 Mile Island, and we had then Chernobyl, and now what is it, Fukushima or
Fukushima?
Fukushima, yes, which is devastating. You have old people now, people my age, saying, I'm going to go there and get cancer and work on the cleanup, because these young people, and the young people are already coming down who've been working out there to clean it up, to make it habitable with cancer that quickly. And
wow.
It's the same thing with fracking. It may not happen in the next 10 years, but massively. But it's there to happen. And it's already immediately happening, and it's trading our future for our kids. If this process becomes irreversible of dramatic climate change and global warming, my granddaughter won't have a life, and we don't know if she'll have a constrained life or no life at a certain point. So the denial of it is crazy, but you have to understand that for some people it's not a matter of logic, it's an act of faith. It's like saying, no, Jews are avaricious, blacks are stupid, and Hispanics are lazy, and I don't care what evidence you present to me. They are that. And if you deny me that, you deny my faith. And that's the way people feel about denying global warming. So you have to realize what you're up against. And you have to also realize that we have won these battles before. You have to realize that it is won it doesn't happen in a moment, and I know the time is short, but that it must be pursued day in and day out. And it might be sooner than you think, because at a certain point, the drama of what we're contending with is so severe that people are going to have to come to their senses, because it's going to threaten, industry. It's going to threaten those moneyed people. In the meantime, we have to make sure that we move towards greater fairness and equity in society, or we're really accelerating the process of the demise of of the environment, because the greater the disparity, the more power influence there will be of moneyed interests, until we go to a system where it's governmentally paid for elections rather than otherwise, and until we say, that those other kinds of organizations that can advocate in that kind of way, in a political way, for candidates with unlimited money, have to be constrained. We have to take back democracy now if we want to ultimately change the policies. And we do that with love and inspiration and heart. That's the only way we can do it. And that's the way civil disobedience exists. Love, inspiration, and heart. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Mwah.